when a stranger knows your deepest secrets before you've even met. The real question isn't how she got in, it's whether you'll ever want her to leave. David pushed open his apartment door, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion settle on his shoulders. Another 12-hour day at the office, another stack of building plans that seemed to never end. He loosened his tie as he stepped inside, already thinking about the leftover pizza waiting in his fridge. But something felt different. The air in his apartment seemed thicker somehow. There was a faint scent he didn't recognize, something floral, expensive. He paused in his entryway, his hand still on the door handle, trying to figure out what was wrong. Then he saw her. A woman sat in his favorite reading chair by the window, as comfortable as if she owned the place. She wasn't doing anything threatening, just sitting there with her legs crossed, watching him with curious eyes. Her long dark hair fell over one shoulder, and she wore a simple black dress that looked more expensive than anything in his closet. David's mouth went dry. His first instinct was to run, but his feet seemed glued to the floor. "Who are you?" he managed to say, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. The woman smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or an apologetic one. It was confident, like she knew something he didn't. "Hello, David," she said, her voice smooth and calm. "I've been waiting for you. How did you get in here?" He looked around his apartment quickly, checking if anything was missing or broken. Everything looked exactly the same as when he'd left that morning. His laptop was still on the coffee table, his keys were still on the kitchen counter, his mail was still scattered where he'd dropped it yesterday. "Does it matter?" she asked, standing up slowly. She was taller than he'd first thought, maybe 5'7". She moved with the kind of grace that suggested she was very sure of herself. "I'm here now." David's heart was beating fast. This was crazy. Someone had broken into his apartment and was acting like they belonged there. He should call the police. He should be angry. But instead he found himself staring at her, trying to figure out how she'd gotten past his locked door, his building security, his carefully organized life. "Look, I don't know who you are or what you want," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But you need to leave. Right now." The woman walked over to his coat closet and opened it like she'd done it 100 times before. She pulled out a hanger, his good wooden hangers, not the cheap wire ones, and carefully hung up her coat. David watched in amazement as she organized it perfectly between his winter jacket and his spare blazer. "I'm Elena," she said, closing the closet door and turning back to him. "And I know you've had a rough day. The Peterson project is giving you trouble, isn't it? Those foundation issues are trickier than you expected." David felt his blood turn cold. The Peterson project was confidential. He'd spent all day dealing with structural problems that weren't supposed to exist. Only 3 people at his firm knew the details, and none of them looked anything like the woman standing in his living room. "How do you know about that?" he asked. Elena walked to his kitchen and opened his refrigerator like she lived there. "You're out of milk," she observed, ignoring his question. "And that pizza has been in there for 3 days. You really should take better care of yourself. This was insane." David pulled out his phone, ready to dial 911, but Elena looked over at him with those calm eyes, and somehow he hesitated. "You're not going to call anyone," she said. It wasn't a threat. It was just a fact, stated as casually as commenting on the weather. "Give me one good reason why not." Elena closed the refrigerator and leaned against his kitchen counter. She looked completely at home, like she'd been living there for years. "Because you're curious," she said. "You've been alone in this apartment for 2 years, David. Same routine every day. Work, home, work, home. When was the last time something interesting happened to you?" He wanted to argue, but she was right. His life had become predictable to the point of being boring. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been surprised by anything, good or bad. "That doesn't give you the right to break into my home," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Break in?" Elena reached into her purse and pulled out something that made David's stomach drop. It was his spare key, the one he kept hidden under the fake rock by his building's back entrance. The hiding spot he was absolutely certain no one else knew about. "You left this in a very predictable place," she said, holding the key up to catch the light from his lamp. "Really, David, a fake rock? Even delivery drivers could figure that one out." David stared at the key. He'd hidden it there 6 months ago after getting locked out once during a rainstorm. He'd chosen that spot specifically because it was out of the way, behind a small bush where no one would think to look. "I've been watching you," Elena continued, setting the key on his counter with a small click. Not in a creepy way. Well, maybe a little creepy. But you fascinate me. You're so careful about everything. Your morning coffee at exactly 7:15. Your lunch break at noon on the dot. The way you organize your pencils by length on your desk. David felt dizzy. Those were all true, but they were small details. Personal habits he didn't think anyone noticed. Elena walked closer to him and he caught that floral scent again. You have potential, David. You just need someone to help you see it. What do you want from me? He whispered. Her smile widened, and for the first time since he'd walked through his door, David felt truly afraid. Not afraid that she would hurt him physically, but afraid of something much more dangerous. Elena's smile was the smile of someone who knew exactly what they wanted, and who always got it. Everything, she said simply. David woke up the next morning expecting to find his apartment empty. Maybe the whole thing had been a strange dream brought on by too much work stress, but when he walked into his kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and Elena stood at his counter perfectly dressed, holding 2 steaming mugs. Good morning, she said, offering him one of the cups. Double shot, no sugar, splash of cream. Just how you like it. David took the mug automatically, his brain still trying to process what was happening. The coffee was perfect, exactly how he made it every morning. But he'd never told her his preferences. You're still here, he said, stating the obvious. Where else would I be? Elena asked, sipping her coffee like this was completely normal. You have that big presentation today with the city planning committee. You'll need to be sharp. David nearly dropped his mug. The presentation was confidential. His company had been working on a proposal for months, and only senior staff knew about the meeting scheduled for that afternoon. How do you know about the presentation? He asked. Elena smiled and walked past him toward the living room. Your dry cleaning is ready for pickup, by the way. That navy suit will be perfect for today. It brings out your eyes. David followed her, feeling like he was in some kind of alternate reality. Elena, you can't just stay here. This is my apartment. My life. Is it really living, though? She asked, settling into his reading chair like it was her throne. David, I've been watching you for weeks. Same coffee shop, same route to work, same lunch from the same deli. You're not living. You're just existing. She was right, and that bothered him more than her mysterious knowledge about his work. His life had become a series of routines, each day blending into the next without anything to mark them as special or memorable. That doesn't explain how you know about my work, he said, sitting on his couch across from her. I make it my business to know, Elena said simply. Knowledge is power, David. And right now you need all the help you can get. The strange thing was, she wasn't wrong about the presentation. David had been nervous about it for weeks. The city contract would make or break his career at the firm, and he'd been losing sleep over every detail. What do you mean, help? He asked. Elena stood up and walked to his desk where his presentation materials were spread out in neat piles. She picked up his notes, scanning them with professional interest. Your opening is too weak, she said after a moment. You're apologizing for taking up their time before you've even started. And this slide about environmental impact, it's buried on page 12. That should be your second point, not an afterthought. David stared at her. Those were the exact same concerns his boss had mentioned yesterday. But Elena was somehow seeing problems that David hadn't even realized were there. Over the next few days, Elena became a constant presence in David's life, but not in the way he expected. She didn't follow him around or make demands. Instead, she seemed to anticipate exactly what he needed, before he knew he needed it. When David came home exhausted after the successful presentation, she had dinner waiting, not just any dinner, but his favorite Thai food from a restaurant he'd mentioned loving to a coworker months ago. When his dress shirt came back from the cleaners with a broken button, she had already sewn on a replacement that matched perfectly. How do you do it? He asked her one evening as they sat eating the perfect meal she'd somehow arranged. How do you always know exactly what I need? I pay attention, Elena said. Most people don't really see each other, David. They're too busy thinking about themselves. But I see you. It was unsettling how right she was about everything. She knew he preferred his apartment cooler at night, so she adjusted the thermostat before he got home. She knew he got headaches when he worked too long under fluorescent lights, so she bought him a desk lamp for his office. She even knew that he secretly hated the way his living room was arranged, and one day he came home to find his furniture rearranged in a way that made the space feel twice as large. You moved my stuff, he said. But he wasn't angry. The new arrangement was actually much better. You hated how cramped it felt, Elena said. Now it flows better. Don't you feel more relaxed? He did, and that was what scared him. Elena was making his life objectively better in ways he couldn't argue with. His coworkers had started commenting on how much more confident he seemed. His boss had complimented his recent work. Even his mother had mentioned during their weekly phone call that he sounded happier. But there were things that bothered him too. Small things that he tried to ignore, like how Elena seemed to know about phone calls he'd made from his office, or how she mentioned a conversation he'd had with his neighbor in the hallway, even though she hadn't been there. Elena, he said one night as they watched a movie she'd somehow known was his favorite. What do you do for work? Where do you live when you're not here? Does it matter? She asked, not taking her eyes off the screen. It matters to me. She turned to look at him then, and her expression was unreadable. I'm here with you, David, isn't that enough? It should have been enough. She was beautiful, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in making him happy, but something in her tone made him feel like he was missing something important. That night, after Elena had gone to sleep in his guest room, David lay awake staring at the ceiling. His life was better than it had been in years, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control of something essential. He just wasn't sure what it was yet. 2 weeks later, David decided he needed some space. Elena's constant presence in his life was starting to feel overwhelming, even though he couldn't deny how much better everything seemed to be going for him. I think you should stay at your place tonight, he told her over breakfast. I just need some time to think. Elena looked up from her coffee, and for just a moment David saw something flash across her face. It was gone so quickly he almost thought he'd imagined it, but it looked like anger. Of course, she said smoothly. I understand completely. Everyone needs their space sometimes. That evening, David felt strange being alone in his apartment. After 2 weeks of Elena's constant presence, the silence felt heavy and unnatural. He tried to enjoy the quiet, but found himself listening for her footsteps in the kitchen or her voice commenting on the news. He was settling down to watch television when his phone rang. The caller ID showed his office number. David, thank goodness you answered, his colleague Tom's voice was urgent. There's been a problem with the Peterson project. David's stomach dropped. What kind of problem? The structural engineer found issues with your calculations. Major issues. The foundation specs you submitted won't support the weight load. If we'd started construction, the whole thing could have collapsed. David felt the room spin around him. That's impossible. I checked those calculations a dozen times. I know you did, but something went wrong. The client is furious. They're talking about pulling the contract and maybe even legal action. You need to get down here right now. David grabbed his keys and rushed to the office, his mind racing. Those calculations had been perfect. He'd worked on them for weeks, double and triple checking every number. There was no way he could have made such a basic error. At the office, he found Tom and their boss waiting with grim expressions. The papers spread across the conference table showed David's signature on specifications that were completely wrong, not just slightly off, but dangerously incorrect. David, what happened? His boss asked. This isn't like you at all. David stared at the papers, his handwriting clear on every page. But he didn't remember making these calculations. The numbers were all wrong, as if someone had changed every figure by just enough to make the structure unsafe. I don't understand, he said. These aren't the numbers I calculated. But that's your signature, Tom pointed out. Your handwriting. Your computer login was used to submit these files. David spent the next 3 hours going through everything, trying to figure out where the mistake had come from. But there was no mistake. Someone had systematically changed his work, and they'd done it so carefully that it looked like his own errors. By the time he got home, it was almost midnight. David expected his apartment to be empty, but Elena was sitting in her usual chair reading a book like nothing had happened. How was your evening? She asked without looking up. Terrible, David said, collapsing onto his couch. Someone sabotaged my work, made it look like I submitted dangerous calculations. I could lose my job over this. Elena closed her book and looked at him with what appeared to be genuine concern. That's awful, David. Do you have any idea who would do such a thing? No, he said. Only a few people have access to my files, and none of them would have any reason to hurt me. Maybe it was just a computer error, Elena suggested. Technology isn't perfect. David wanted to believe that, but something about Elena's tone bothered him. She sounded almost too casual about the whole thing, like she was reading from a script. Over the next few days, similar problems started cropping up everywhere in David's life. His credit card was mysteriously charged for purchases he didn't make. His gym membership was canceled without his knowledge. His car failed inspection because of problems that hadn't existed the week before. Each incident was small enough to seem like bad luck or honest mistakes, but together they painted a picture of David as someone whose life was falling apart. "I don't understand what's happening," he confided to Elena as they sat in his living room. "It's like everything is going wrong at once." "Maybe you're just stressed," Elena said, moving closer to him on the couch. "All this pressure at work, living alone, no real support system. It's a lot for anyone to handle." Her words should have been comforting, but instead they made David feel worse. Because she was right. He didn't have a real support system. He'd been so focused on work for the past few years that he'd let most of his friendships fade away. Elena was basically the only person in his life who seemed to care about him. That night, David couldn't sleep. Something was nagging at him, a feeling that he was missing something obvious. He got up and walked to his home office, thinking maybe some work would help clear his head. That's when he noticed his filing cabinet. The lock was still secure, but the papers inside were organized differently than he remembered. David always kept his personal documents in a specific order: insurance papers in the front, tax documents behind those, personal letters in the back. But now everything was mixed up, like someone had gone through them and put them back wrong. David pulled out his files and spread them across his desk. Everything was there, but someone had definitely been through his personal documents. His bank statements, his employment contracts, even old letters from college friends. As he looked through the papers, David found something that made his blood run cold. Tucked between his tax documents was a photocopy of a letter he'd written to his ex-wife 3 years ago, a personal letter he'd never sent, one he'd kept in a box in his bedroom closet. The letter contained his deepest fears and insecurities, things he'd never told anyone. Fears about not being good enough, not being successful enough, not being worthy of love. It was the kind of raw, honest writing that people only do when they think no one will ever read it. Someone had found that letter, copied it, and put it in his files where he would eventually find it. But who and why? David looked toward his bedroom where Elena was sleeping peacefully. She was the only person who'd had access to his apartment, the only one who could have gone through his private things. But that would mean Elena wasn't trying to help him at all. It would mean everything that had been happening, the work problems, the personal issues, even the good things, were all part of some elaborate plan. David sat at his desk until dawn, staring at the copied letter and trying to understand what Elena really wanted from him. By the time the sun came up, he had reached a terrible conclusion. Elena wasn't trying to make his life better. She was systematically taking it apart, piece by piece, until he would have nothing left but her. David waited until Elena left for her mysterious daily errands before he started his investigation. She always disappeared for exactly 2 hours every afternoon, never explaining where she went or what she did. Today he was going to use that time to find out who she really was. He started with his computer, searching for any trace of Elena online. Social media profiles, professional listings, anything that might give him a clue about her background. But it was like she didn't exist outside of his apartment. No Elena matching her description appeared in any search results. Then David remembered something. A few days earlier, Elena had received a phone call while she was making breakfast. She'd stepped onto his balcony to take it, but he'd caught a few words through the glass door, something about the previous assignment and timeline adjustments. Assignment. The word had stuck with him because it sounded so formal, so professional. Like Elena was following some kind of plan. David searched his apartment more thoroughly than he ever had before. In his guest room closet, behind Elena's carefully hung clothes, he found a small black bag he'd never seen before. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside were files, thick manila folders filled with photographs, documents, and handwritten notes. The first folder had his name written on the tab in Elena's neat handwriting. David's stomach turned as he flipped through the contents. There were photos of him taken from a distance, walking to work, grocery shopping, sitting alone in restaurants. Some of the pictures were months old, taken long before Elena had appeared in his apartment. But the documents were even worse. Elena had compiled detailed reports on his daily habits, his work schedule, his relationships with coworkers. She knew his salary, his bank account balance, even his medical history. There were copies of emails he'd sent from his work computer, transcripts of phone calls he'd made from his office. At the bottom of the folder, David found something that made his blood freeze. It was a psychological profile, written in Elena's handwriting, analyzing his personality traits and emotional vulnerabilities. Words like isolated, approval-seeking, and susceptible to manipulation were circled in red ink. David's hands were trembling as he opened the second folder. This one was labeled with a different name, Michael Chen. Inside were similar photos and documents, but of a man David had never seen before. A man who looked lonely and successful, just like David. The third folder was labeled Robert Walsh, same pattern. Photos, documents, psychological analysis. David counted 6 folders total. 6 different men, all roughly his age, all living alone, all apparently targeted by Elena in the same systematic way he had been. At the bottom of the bag was a notebook filled with Elena's observations and plans. David read with growing horror as Elena described her methods for gaining access to each man's life, earning their trust and then slowly taking control of their entire existence. A subject responds well to subtle validation, read one entry about Michael Chen. Confidence issues make him easy to manipulate through carefully timed praise and criticism. About Robert Walsh, she had written, financial insecurity is primary weakness. Subject will sacrifice personal boundaries for promise of stability. David flipped to the section about himself. David requires careful handling due to analytical nature. Direct confrontation will cause resistance. Must maintain illusion that positive changes are coincidental rather than orchestrated. The notebook detailed exactly how Elena had sabotaged his work projects, created the various problems in his personal life, and then positioned herself as the solution to difficulties she had created herself. David was still reading when he heard Elena's key in the front door. He quickly stuffed everything back into the bag and closed the closet, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she would hear it. David, Elena called from the living room. I brought you those protein bars you mentioned liking. He walked out to meet her, trying to keep his expression neutral. Elena smiled at him with that same confident smile she'd worn since the first night. But now David could see it differently. It wasn't confidence, it was the smile of a predator who knew her prey was trapped. Thank you, he said, accepting the protein bars. Elena, I need to talk to you about something. Of course, she said, settling into her chair. What's on your mind? David took a deep breath. I know what you're doing. Elena's expression didn't change, but David noticed her posture become more alert. What do you mean? The files in your bag. The other men you've done this to. Michael Chen, Robert Walsh, all of them. I know this is some kind of game to you. For a long moment, Elena just looked at him. Then slowly her smile widened. Oh, David, she said, and her voice was different now. Colder. More calculating. You weren't supposed to find those for another few weeks. I'm a little disappointed in your timing. David felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Even knowing what she was, hearing her admit it so casually was shocking. What do you want from me? He asked. Elena stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city below. What I want is simple, David. I want to see how far I can push someone before they break. I want to understand what happens when you take away everything that makes a person feel secure and replace it with something better, but completely artificial. You've destroyed my career, my finances, my reputation, David said. How's any of that better? But I've also made you feel more alive than you have in years, Elena replied, turning back to him. When was the last time you felt this much emotion, David? When was the last time anything in your life felt this important? David realized with horror that she was right. Despite everything, despite the fear and confusion and anger, he felt more awake than he had in months. You're sick, he said. Maybe, Elena agreed, but I'm also very good at what I do. And here's what's going to happen next, David. You're going to have to choose. Choose what? Elena's smile became almost gentle, which made it even more terrifying. You can try to fight me. Try to expose what I've done, try to rebuild your life from scratch. But I should warn you, I've been very thorough. Your co-workers think you're unstable. Your family thinks you're having a breakdown. Your few remaining friends think you've been acting strange for weeks. David's throat felt tight. Or you can accept that this is your life now. Accept that I know you better than you know yourself, and that I can give you things you never even knew you wanted. Elena walked closer to him, and David found himself unable to move. Think about it. David, when was the last time someone cared enough about you to pay such close attention? When was the last time someone worked so hard to understand exactly what you needed? That's not caring, David said, but his voice sounded weak even to himself, isn't it? Elena asked. I've spent months learning everything about you. I've arranged my entire life around making you feel important. Most people will never have someone focus on them the way I've focused on you. David stared at her, realizing that he was facing an impossible choice. Fight her and lose everything he had left, or surrender to her completely and lose himself instead. Elena seemed to read his thoughts. You don't have to decide right now, she said. But you will have to decide soon. That night David lay awake knowing that his old life was over one way or another. The only question was what would replace it.